at the Comox Valley Land Trust, of course, we've had a good opportunity to engage with and integrate with the work of Father Charles Brandt in the last few years. We're very happy to be able to have protected the property that he lived on in his hermitage, and I know he's a person that's had an influence in this group in a very significant way. So again, huge congratulations to the work of the Tsolum River Restoration Society, and it's just such an honor to be able to speak with you all today, so thank you for coming. And it's also so nice to see so many friends in the crowd today too. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the land protection side of things. It's kind of one of the areas of my expertise, I would say, and focusing that conversation on the Tsolum River. So I think my presentation is fairly short, and hopefully there will be lots of time for discussion towards the end. So let's just get started. So you've heard Laura recently just mention a couple of times the Comox Valley Conservation Partnership. So the Comox Valley Conservation Partnership is something the Land Trust has sort of coordinated, but really it brings together 29 different conservation organizations in the Comox Valley, and we're very happy that the Tsolum River Restoration Society is one of those. We meet monthly as a steering committee and collectively tried to advocate in a very proactive and positive way with local governments to affect positive environmental changes on the landscape. And so one of the things that we've been doing is keeping an eye on the status of sensitive ecosystems in the Comox Valley through updating the sensitive ecosystem inventory, which is one of the map layers that you're probably fairly familiar with as a group here in the valley. And our most recent update was almost 10 years ago, and this is kind of the snapshot of that most recent update. We're actually planning on updating it again in 2022, so we'll have another 10-year update coming up really soon. But from what we can tell, based on our last iteration, is that we have only about 5% of sensitive ecosystems remaining in an intact status here in the Comox Valley. It's pretty poor number, to be honest. It gets a little bit better if you look at things that are sort of intact but degraded. Maybe there's a new road that's gone through, or maybe there's an intensification of trail use or something like that, but still sort of hovering around 17% of the valley in what's sort of an intact condition or close to it. And that includes the Tsolum Valley, as you can see here on the map. There's a lot of black being things that had been mapped as sensitive ecosystems that are now considered lost. In a lot of those cases, it's probably lost from logging, but there are other kinds of developments that can happen in our area that cause for these ecosystems to be lost as well, residential development, etc. So that's just kind of setting the stage of where we're at on the sort of more terrestrial side of things in the Tsolum watershed. So before my time with the Comox Valley Land Trust, backing up to about 2015, the CVLT hired Michelle Jones of Mimulus Biological Consultants to come up with our Land Protection Prioritization Plan, or the LPPP as we call it. And the concept here was to realize the fact that we need to be very strategic and focused on picking the best places for conservation in the valley, rather than kind of waiting for the phone to ring or striking out to opportunities that might not be the most high leverage. But again, using the SEI data as the backbone for the analysis, Michelle led the process through 3 different phases, looking at the SEI polygons that were intact, sort of doing a pre-screening stage, a screening stage, and then a much more detailed analysis, ultimately resulting in the identification of 25 high priority sites. And one of the things that guided that work was they decided to look specifically within municipalities and within settlement nodes that were proposed through the regional growth strategy, or consistent with the regional growth strategy, thinking that those places were probably the most at risk due to the development that is relatively more permissible in those areas. So just hold on to that thought for a moment. Then when I came along in 2016, the CVLT asked me to build off of the existing 3 phases worth of work into phase 4. And really what they wanted me to do was this first bullet point here, just do a deep dive into those 25 high priority sites, figure out how many parcels of land they in total contributed to, who owned them, that kind of thing, what the zoning was, that kind of thing, and get ready to set the stage for a more strategic, focused approach to doing some conservation work on those particular sites. But what I felt needed to happen when I stepped into that project was to back it up a little bit and to include some elements that hadn't been included in the first 3 phases. So we looked at things, for example, like species at risk, where they are on the landscape. We wanted to talk to some boots on the ground experts, like people from the Tsolum River Restoration Society, to see if there were places that we'd missed that weren't being captured properly in that first 3 phases, and look at some of the other conservation plans that were swirling around out there, those done by, say, for example, the Nature Conservancy of Canada or the Coastal Douglas Fir Conservation Partnership, etc. And as well to do a viability analysis and the threats and opportunities analysis.
What?
Go ahead, there was a question. What? I'll probably catch up on your question. I think I know where you're going with that. So viability analysis means, like, out of those 25 sites that we've identified, which ones have actually a high degree of ecological integrity? Which ones are likely going to persist into the long term? Due to several factors that the BC Conservation Data Centre and others across North America have determined are the important factors. So size, condition, and landscape context are the 3 components that we looked at for each of the identified areas. And then threats and opportunities. So the threats analysis has been really well developed by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN. So we used their international methodologies to look at the threats to the parcels that we were interested in and kind of rank them based on their relative threat and their relative potential for long-term viability as conservation areas. So basically just drawing on international standards to kind of guide our science work. The problem with that approach, to be quite honest, is that the Tsolum River shows up as being a bit of a blind spot in this conservation plan that we've developed. And part of it is because phase 1, 2, 3 really focused on looking at municipalities and looking at urban settlement nodes, I think they're called, or urban growth nodes in the regional growth strategy, most of which are not in the Tsolum River watershed. So it inherently skewed away from the Tsolum in that way. And then with our own opportunities analysis, we're thinking about it from a land trust perspective. Basically our model is to either buy land or have it donated, work with conservation covenants, which is one of our more important tools, or work proactively with our partners at local government to develop policy that would tend towards protection of sensitive ecosystems. And as you'll probably all be quite aware, the majority of land in the Tsolum River watershed's in the ALR. And so in that case, option number A, we're not going to be really in the business of buying an entire farm to try and protect the back 40, because it's got a house on it, it's got hay fields, it's like actively in the process of producing food. It's not a really good fit as a standalone kind of conservation acquisition necessarily. But we're also blocked by the Agricultural Land Commission from using conservation covenants on ALR land. So we're not allowed to hold covenants on ALR land. So that also eliminates, pretty much the whole entire Tsolum Valley from our ability to use conservation covenants. Again, that being our main tool. And similarly, it's more difficult to work through local government policy because the ALR or ALC works at a provincial level of policy that is situated above local government policy. So whatever is allowable in the ALR or ALC scenario is often something that local governments can't affect, change. And that's not necessarily 100% true, but it's mostly true. So the ability to work on ALR land has been a real blind spot for the land trust, and thus for the Tsolum watershed. So, sorry, Earl. we've been trying, but it's been difficult. to find a way where we can have an effective mechanism to protect the best of what's left in terms of biodiversity and natural intact habitats and sensitive ecosystems in the soil and watershed. Our hands are tied behind our backs somewhat there. Another potential problem is the potential for agricultural expansion in the regional district. And of course, we're super keen on food security and local food production. Don't get us wrong here, that's so important to our community. But what we can see from some of the studies that the CVRD has commissioned is that we have 7,200 hectares of ALR land in the Tsolum watershed, only about half of which have been cleared for agriculture. So both 50-50. And so what this map is showing you in crosshatches, like this kind of color here, is ALR land that hasn't been cleared. And the stuff that's solid green is ALR land that has been cleared. So you can kind of see the pattern on the landscape there. If the ALR was built out to its maximum capacity, we would be losing some pretty important sensitive ecosystems and habitats in the valley. So we want to be able to be live to that. Currently, out of that total of 7,200 hectares, only about a quarter, a little more than a quarter, is actively being farmed. And only 6% is being irrigated. And that's something that's quite relevant to the salmon populations in the Tsolum, because we see there's already a problem with not enough water in the river fish. So if we imagine and broadcast out what a full agricultural expansion scenario could look like here, could be quite a significantly different situation than what we're already seeing. And there's only about 1% of this landscape that's protected, which is a far cry from even the 30% that people are talking about these days. So we need to figure out a way to do more and to work proactively with the agricultural community in that way. So Salinas, California on the left, Merville on the right. You sort of get the picture, I think. This is where we're at right now. And you can see all of the land in the foreground of the photo is ALR land, and you can see there's beautiful little pockets of forest here and there, some amazing intact riparian areas, or at least functional riparian areas, compared to what a sort of a full-blown agricultural expansion scenario could look like. And so I think we're kind of from the perspective of trying to preserve biodiversity, including fish, we need to save a little bit more of the intact sensitive ecosystems on farmland in the Tsolum River watershed, I think. And so another sort of circumstance here, I know this is a lot of words, I hate the slide because it's way too many words, so I'm sorry for that, but is going to take you on a little bit of a history lesson really quickly here. So 1880s, James McLaren and Frank Ross acquired 100,000 acres of land from the Dunsmuirs. Of course, you'll probably all be familiar with the fact that the Dunsmuirs got this E&N land grant, etc., etc. So James and Frank bought a big chunk of that from the Dunsmuirs, and they set up 2 mills in the Lower Mainland. One of them was called Fraser Mills, and it was somewhat problematic for various reasons, so they decided to sell it. And along with the sale of that particular mill, they sold all of the portion of the Dunsmuir land that they had acquired in the Comox Valley. And they sold it to a fellow named Lester David, who sort of changed the name slightly and called it the Fraser River Sawmills. And he set up the first logging camp on the Tsolum, which I believe was kind of around in the Sandwick area. Lester David also bought additional lands in Dove Creek, on the Tsolum, and up in Black Creek. And back in the day, that was at the time when they had already logged everything that you could reach from the river and everything you could reach from the shoreline of the coast, because there were really no roads, no rail. So that first pass of logging had already happened with all the easy to reach stuff. And so what Lester did was he really got good at sourcing what he called farm timber. So these are people that have preempted land and on the basis of clearing it for agriculture, but maybe only cleared a portion of it, and the majority was still left uncleared. And so Fraser River Mills were working really hard at that time with the agricultural community to clear land for them and take the logs to market. So that was going well, but he kind of overextended himself with his financing, so he was required to sell again to McRae and Davidson, who carried on that practice of looking for farm timber in the Tsolum watershed. And their model was to switch to sort of rail-based logging, and so they started building the One Spot Trail, and the One Spot was, of course, named after the locomotive that ran on wood and was busy bringing big logs down from the Tsolum River watershed and dumping them into the river at Sandwick. But again, they ran into financial problems, and so it wasn't until 1910 where Sir William Mackenzie and Sir Donald Mahon bought Fraser River Lumber, and they started a subsidiary company called Comox Logging and Railway, and that's sort of one of the main groups that we think about in our history. That one of the trains is down there in Courtenay on display, and they were successful for something like 50 years. But the main portion of the land that they bought was what was called Block 29. That's a little bit further to the north of us. So they still aggressively pursued farm timber as they were working their way towards Block 29. And it wasn't really until 1914, when they did reach Block 29, that they kind of stopped focusing on trying to clear the preemptions and the agricultural zone from old growth forests. So we've got this period of about from 1902 till about 1914, a little bit carrying on into 1916, where that big portion of the lower Tsolum sort of floodplain forests were being fairly aggressively logged with their old growth timber. And so that's about 100 to 120 years ago. So a lot of those forests that were cleared at that time were basically just naturally regenerated because the farmers, the producers, didn't necessarily have the equipment, time, whatever, to blast all the stumps out and completely convert it to pasture. So a lot of that land just reverted back to forest again, naturally. And so there's a significant portion of the land base that is in that sort of 100 to 120-year-old natural regen forest status, which is about as close to intact old growth that you will find in the Tsolum watershed. And so it's also the fact that timber values are particularly high right now. And so I think some of those areas might be quite ripe for a second harvest. So a bit of a history there. So that's what the forests would have looked like around the Tsolum River and the sort of Sandwick area in 1906, 1907. So that's the kind of stuff they were taking. And I don't think I can think of a place in the Tsolum watershed that looks kind of like that anymore. Mm-hmm. So they were fairly efficient at what they did. And I don't have a really good air photo of the Tsolum from that era, but I do have one from the Puntledge. I don't think it would have looked a whole lot different. So this is the Puntledge River in 1929. The Fish and Game Club would be just like maybe about a kilometer down there. Comox Lake, pretty much right here kind of thing. They didn't really leave a lot. But if we look at the landscape pattern today, it's it's a whole lot better probably than what was the case 100 to 120 years ago in terms of habitat value. So you can see the Tsolum kind of winding through the photo here. And I just randomly grabbed this out of the watershed. I didn't mean to sort of intentionally pick on this particular neighborhood or anything. The land use patterns are kind of similar up and down. But what we'll see here is the ortho photo in the background, or satellite photo in the background is one thing, but overlaid on top of it is the sensitive ecosystem inventory polygons. So this color is meant to be riparian. This is meant to be mature second growth. And the purple here is what they call terrestrial herbaceous. So probably including a component of Gary Oak is my guess there, but I didn't do a deep dive. So this map is just from the CVLT's IMAP system. So you can see that there's some significant sensitive ecosystems that have regenerated from that historic process over the past century. But there's also possibly quite a bit that is mature second growth forest that should be captured in the SEI that's not. And that's one of the projects that the Land Trust is going to work on this summer, is to go and find those places and see if we can promote them as SEI polygons for the benefit of land use planning, basically. So we'll be looking at that. So what are the solutions here? We've got this blind spot, we've got this historical problem, we've got some issues with the Agricultural Land Commission, etc. Like I mentioned before, we probably don't really want to buy the farm, we want to keep the farm farming, but we can't use covenants to protect the back 40, which we're not allowed. And a lot of the local government land use controls that we're quite, keen on supporting and helping with are somewhat superseded by the provincial ALR designation. So what can we do? And that's where this right to take comes in. There's a legal tool that we haven't got any direct experience working with yet, but which has been used periodically in British Columbia by conservation organizations, called profit a prondra. And so again, the translation there meaning basically the right to take. And so essentially what it boils down to is if there was a farmer who was interested and willing, key part being willing, that had sort of the back 40 of their 160 acres in natural habitat, they would be able to, say for example, donate to us the right to that timber, meaning that the Land Trust would be the only group that would be able to log it. And of course, under our constitution and bylaws, we would choose not to log it, so it would be de facto protected. And the key thing there is that the Agricultural Land Commission does not have the authority to review, approve, or deny profit or prondra transactions. So it's basically a way of using like a conservation covenant, although slightly different, without their getting in our way, essentially. So this is an interesting tool, and it's something that I think is worth having a little bit more of a conversation about here in Tsolum to try and get around that blind spot problem. So again, the profit of prondra, it's registered on title, and lasts in perpetuity. So even if the farmer were to sell their land or donate it to their kids when they passed away or whatever, the profit of prondra would still stay in perpetuity, and those trees would still be owned by the Land Trust or the Tsolum River Restoration Society, or you fill in the blank with whomever. So it's a way of protecting this land in perpetuity. There can also be some agreements associated with the profit of prondra that might be more specific around particular details that might be relevant to the conservation group or the landowner. So it's a fairly flexible tool. And so here, just on the left, is just an example of just a screenshot, really, of a report about how to use profit of prondras that was put out by the Land Trust Alliance of British Columbia. So the Land Trust Alliance is a group that brings together all of the different land trusts in British Columbia under one common banner, kind of like the way the CVCP does locally here with streamkeepers groups. So the Comox Valley Land Trust would be a member of the Land Trust Alliance, for example. So they've got some background information to help land trusts understand what this tool is and how it can be used. And their work has been completed by West Coast Environmental Law and people like that understand the rules of engagement, as it were. So this is an interesting opportunity that I think we might mutually benefit from exploring.
That phrase, profit of prondra, is that Latin?
French. Yep.
I wasn't sure if it was the other thing.
Profit to take, I think, is the way my rudimentary French would describe it literally, but those others have suggested that the right to take is a more appropriate interpretation. So pilot projects, Comox Valley Land Trust at the moment is engaged in a project of a similar nature on the Puntledge River. Again, you can see the Comox Lake Dam right here, and the Puntledge flowing through the property there, fishing game over here. So this is land that's owned by BC Hydro, They bought it from Canadian Collieries in the 1950s. So Canadian Collieries is basically the Dunsmuir coal mining interests. The Dunsmuirs had a dam on the lake going back to 1912, I believe it was. And so BC Hydro took over the operation of that hydroelectric generation infrastructure. But when Canadian Collieries sold the land to Hydro, they kept the timber rights. So it's sort of like they kept a profit of Pronja, if you will, over the forest. And those timber rights were passed on from Canadian Collieries to other interests over time and are currently owned by Manulife, formerly known as Hancock, for those of you that are tuned into logging companies in the valley. So we're working hard with our partners to try and acquire that timber reservation over about 100 hectares of land on both sides of the Tsolum River. So the point being is that we've had our lawyers do a deep dive onto the mechanisms of making sure that if we were to buy that timber reservation, that we would not be required to log it at some point in the future, and that it would actually be a conservation area should we take title to the timber reservation. And they've provided us with the satisfaction that yes, that would be the case if we were to take title to that. We would own it in perpetuity and protect that forest forever. So same as the Prophet of Pronja, just has a different name really. So wish us luck. But back to the Tsolum, we've updated back to the land protection prioritization exercise that I mentioned at the beginning. We decided to update it in 2020, so a little bit more recently, because some of the land that we've identified in the 2016 work we've now protected, some of it's been logged, so we just wanted to rejig things and understand where things are at. And I was pretty keen on adding this concept of protecting land in the Tsolum through the Profit Pronja mechanism into our land protection prioritization exercise. So I did a little bit of a deeper dive into what that looks like, and I don't expect anybody to be able to read this table on the side. I just put it up there to show this column is the specific property identification numbers, or PIDs, of land in the Tsolum Valley that's in the ALR, in the CVLT. And in this column is the size of each lot. And in this column is the size of the natural ecosystem that still exists on that lot. And so what we see from that kind of analysis is that there's basically about 47 lots, and some of those lots might be owned by the same person, so I'm not really sure what the ownership would be like. It could be that there's maybe 30 owners, or maybe it's 25, or maybe it's 47. But there's a number of farms in the valley floor that have habitat that I think we'd be interested in. The total area of those lots is 911 hectares, but that includes 557 hectares of intact SEI ecosystems, whether they're riparian forests or mature second growth forest, etc. So we've done some analysis on that. We've figured out where these areas are, and I think it might be fun to work with more closely with the Tsolum River Restoration Society and perhaps the Comox First Nation to understand if there are ways to kind of prioritize amongst that list of 47 and find places that are of mutual interest, and see if we can't maybe find some landowners that would be willing to engage with us on taking a run at doing a pilot project of using the Profit of Pronja model to protect some land in the Tsolum watershed in critical areas. Question?
Is the whole parcel protected, or can you geo-limit it to just certain areas on the parcel?
Geo-limit it to certain areas on the parcel. Yeah, because again, we wouldn't have any interest in the hay fields, the house, that stuff is not our target. And I think I see one in the way back and then one in the, so yeah, you go ahead first with the hat there.
That area you showed on the Tsolum River, that's not the ALR anyway.
No, that's not, and you're right, that's in sort of a different circumstance in that case, but the model is basically the same. You wouldn't need to, or sorry, I should say, you could use a Profit of Pronja on any kind of land. It's not that it has to be ALR to use a Profit of Pronja. It's just that it is probably the only tool that you can use on ALR.
But you wouldn't need to use it on that property, would you?
You wouldn't need to if BC Hydro wanted to sell the property, which they're not going to.
But you couldn't do it unless you bought the property, is that it? Other than the other one.
Can you clarify that for me, please?
Well, you couldn't protect that area unless you bought the property, is that what you're saying?
In the case of the hydro property, there would be two ways to. Well, there's only one way to protect it, really, and that is to buy the timber reservation. If you bought the land, the logging company would still own the timber reservation. The land's not for sale anyway. Obviously, BC Hydro is going to stay there for a while. But regardless of what BC Hydro says, the land is going to get logged. They don't own the trees, somebody else does. They have the right to take it. So in that case, the only way to protect that property would be to buy that timber reservation from the owners of it.
And they have the right to take those logs again in 100 years, right?
Yep, in perpetuity.
Yeah.
Arzina?
Tim, is there a possibility of putting an incentive like carbon credits for the farming? If they were gonna do something like that?
Yeah, it is possible. There's you've probably heard in the news, or maybe you have, that Mosaic Forest Management has just come up with a new carbon scheme. So they're planning on putting, I think it's 40,000 hectares of their privately owned forest, airing on old growth areas, into a carbon bank basically, and then selling those carbon credits through the voluntary carbon standard or VCS standard on the international market. So they're only basically deferring that harvesting for 25 years. So the avoided deforestation over a 25-year time frame is what's generating the credit, and after that 25 years, it's just back into the timber harvesting land base again. So that's how those models typically work, and that's not necessarily bad. It's like it holds the fort a little, but it's not protection in perpetuity. And what Mosaic has said is that they'd be willing to work with other landowners, large landowners typically, that have larger forests, to include their land into their carbon play for a fee, I'm sure. So there's potential mechanisms there, but otherwise trying to get a carbon project off the ground by working with our colleagues in the United States, what we've learned is that it is really only cost effective when you get to like the 7,000 hectares or greater size, because the cost of doing all the verification and the auditing that goes into the carbon planning is cost prohibitive for a small independent operator. So group carbon projects could work, but seems like for whatever reason Canada, perhaps even BC specifically, are a little gun shy on taking steps to really promote that, whereas in Washington State and elsewhere they're being a little bit more proactive there. So potentially, but the tool's not really well developed yet. It's basically the short answer.
We actually went in the other direction. We changed our forest laws to go from 50 years to 35 to take out trees.
Yeah.
And also during the strike, Mosaic sold a large amount of their timber to China, and that as a percentage was used as the number of what would could be sent to China, even though there wasn't very much volume at the time. So that's where a lot of the trees are going now, is to China.
Yeah, when private managed forest lands are regulated separately from crown land, and there is that same prohibition around export market is not relevant to private managed forest land. So what's happening right now is that the domestic market is building in price or building in value so fast that now the domestic log prices are almost on par with the export market for some particular types of trees in particular cases.
Yeah.
And so, the demand is shifting a little bit from domestic to export, but by and large, the private managed forest land people send to China and Japan and Korea, because they can, and they get more for it. So that, not to knock on them too hard, but they're basically pension funds. So if you're like a BC government employee or, etc., that's your pension that they're earning for you. So they seem to get.
So I think Mosaic can only export 30%, and 70% has to stay in BC.
I don't think that's true. No, I think they can export as much as they want.
No, they can't.
Really?
It's to create jobs in BC. You have to retain some of the wood in BC. So
On crown land, you definitely have to make your wood available to any local mill that will take it before you're allowed to even consider the export market. But that's not the same on private managed forest land reserve lands, as far as I know. So.
I can comment. I actually work for Mosaic.
Oh, great.
We advertise our timber domestically first.
Fantastic.
So if there is a demand for it domestically, it's sold domestically
And-
for sure.
And is that because you're required to, or because you choose to?
It's required to actually.
Oh,
by,
okay.
the majority of companies in BC.
Great. Well, I was getting a slightly different story from other private managed forest land owners in the last couple of days, so my apologies if I got that mixed up. Great. There was one more question in the far back I didn't get to. Yeah, go ahead.
Chances of a profit above, does that mean you can only, you would only work with people who have ALR land that is being farmed, or would you work with people who have ALR land that is not being farmed, in small parcels?
Either or both. Yeah. Yeah, whether or not it's being farmed doesn't matter, and it doesn't have to be ALR land to use this model. It's just that this model is one of the only models that's that doesn't incur a review from the Agricultural Land Commission. And so if it's a private landowner that has a lot that's in the ALR that's completely undeveloped or unimproved, sure, you could work to protect 100% of that lot with that model. Or if it's a landowner in the ALR that has 50% of the land improved for agriculture and the other 50% is natural, you can work with that person too. Or if you have someone who owns land that's not in the ALR and still wants to use that particular model, that would also be fine. But the crux here is that we can't use covenants in the ALR, and we're likely not going to try to buy a farm that's, obviously a working farm for various reasons. So it's a tool that operationalizes our ability to protect important habitats on a portion of a property, regardless of its status.
Has the land, like the BC Land Alliance, have they ever had discussions with the ALC about maybe allowing conservation covenants?
Yeah, for probably about 20 years, the conversation's been ongoing. And it's typically been Ducks Unlimited, the Nature Conservancy of Canada, the Land Conservancy of BC, and the LTA BC that have been kind of trying to negotiate a different outcome with the ALC. And I think basically that everyone's just given up because they don't seem to be willing to move on that at all. And I mean, I understand their perspective, that it's like nature conservation is an allowable use of agricultural land in the agricultural land reserve. There's no problem there. But their job is to make sure that there isn't anything that can prohibit agriculture from ever taking place in the future. So they're trying to protect it for agricultural sake. And that can look like different things in different places. Like, a sea of greenhouses in the Fraser Valley, for example, is a viable use of agricultural land. But maybe it's not so good if you're a migratory waterfowl. It depends on rustling through the aftermath of a crop. So it's a little bit of a blunt mechanism, I think, but we understand where they're coming from, and it's not an ignoble kind of perspective to have. But when it comes to, our community.
So I'd like to give an example. So for example, Tsolum Spirit Park was carved off of a piece of property, and because it was large enough, it could be subdivided as per the ALR, and then it was either purchased or given to the CVLT, I don't know which. So, but
Yeah.
it is ALR land that has been deeded.
Yeah, and Laura earlier in the night mentioned Tsolum Commons Park, which is up on Railway Ave, and that happens to be a case where there's a private lot that's entirely within the ALR that the owners, the 18 odd different owners of that parcel, wanted to see it protected and conserved, approached the land trust. We worked so hard to try and put a covenant on it because our group tends not to want to own land. We're a pretty small operation. And so we worked really hard to get a covenant on it. ALC said no. So what we did instead was they donated the land to us, so we are the owners of it, and then we leased it to the CVRD for 99 years for a community park, with the opportunity to extend that lease for another 99 years. So we had to kind of break our own rules around being willing to own land in order for that project to proceed the way that everybody wanted it to proceed. And that was fine. We were able to do that with confidence, knowing that the CVRD is a really strong partner and that we had no concerns about their land management now or in the future. So those kinds of things can happen, but it has to be one whole parcel at a time. It can't ever be a part of a parcel.
No, it can be a part of a parcel if the parcel is subdivided and then either deeded or bought.
Yeah. And that typically is going to be for maybe larger parcels. And the process of going through the subdivision with the ALC is what it is.
So I think the minimum on ALR2 is 23 acres.
Right.
Who pays the taxes on that part?
On the Tsolum Commons part? in
Is there
particular.
any tax payable on it?
It would be the responsibility of the CVRD as the lessee of the part of the property. And I think in that particular case, they put it on the schedule of tax exemption, so they weren't paying taxes on their property that they own. If I have that right.
Tim, regarding the puntage, the hydro property along the puntage, if Manulife has the timber rights there, have they been approached?
They approached us, the other way to put it.
So there's a potential deal there?
Working on it. It's an ambitious goal, but we'll see what we can do. Stewie.
Hey, Tim, is that principle, the profit of progress, is that something that came from France? How far back in time did it go? Is that something practiced in Europe, or did they bring that thought process to North America, like the New World, and institute like a new principle for this area because it's so vast?
No, it goes back to Europe.
It does go back.
Most of our land legislation and statutes do come from a European context.
But not far enough back in time that it was Latin, but more recent. So
It likely was.
centuries, but not
It was
millennia.
definitely Latin at one time.
It might have been Latin at one time, but it came to us, I think, from France. So like even when we use conservation covenants, the Land Title Act of British Columbia is what enables us to use conservation covenants and for conservation purposes. Prior to that, if you wanted to put a covenant or a servitude, as it's known in French, on a property, you had to have what was called dominant tenement. So it's like you had to own the bigger piece, and say you subdivided off a smaller piece, and you could kind of dictate what happened on that smaller piece by way of a covenant or a servitude. And that goes way back.
Right, centuries.
Yeah. And so now what our law enables us to do is to use a conservation covenant on any parcel regardless of whether you have the dominant tenement or not. And that's relatively new in the context of land law, going back to Europe.
Only on land, not in the
Yeah, only on land, not in the AR, yeah, exactly.
So would the value of the land be based on what the timber's worth then for this transaction?
The value of the timber would be based on a timber valuation. So you would have someone that's accredited to do timber valuations on private land, go and do a survey, figure out what volumes are there, what grades, look at the market value at whatever period of time, and come up with a dollar figure, and that would be what the profit of Pondra would be worth in real time in that moment. And then the
Minus
land
the cost of removal.
minus the cost to remove it. Yes, thank you. And so that would be, the net value, and that could be either a donation made by the landowner, or theoretically you could pay them for it if they weren't willing to donate it. Yeah.
What you're buying is the timber, you're not buying the land.
Right.
So
So the landowner would still have complete unfettered access to use that portion of the property for everything else other than the living trees. So quiet use and enjoyment, for example, or other things along those lines. It wouldn't be publicly available for access. You couldn't necessarily make it a park and put a trail through it. All that stuff would still be private land that they would own and control, except for the green deposit.
So this hasn't been done in this area before or anywhere on Vancouver Island?
Not by a conservation organization. I think it's a tool that possibly has been used by forest companies and farmers coming to an agreement. As we have this history lesson on farm timber, I think there might be some examples of that locally. But conservation organizations have used it in British Columbia effectively. I'm aware of a couple examples in the ranch lands of the BC interior that are in the ALR, where you've got intact grasslands mixed with, intact forest, where conservation groups have acquired profit or Pondra from the intact forests part, to protect the future logging potential from those parcels. Kamloops area, for
Thinking about your
example.
thoughts on how to engage farmers to incentivize this for them.
Yeah, totally. And again, hopefully there would be some agricultural producers in the valley that are pro-conservation, that would like to leave a legacy. Maybe there's some farmers that have been around for generations that want to see their family make a contribution towards biodiversity protection and would consider donating them. But if not that, there's the possibility to provide value to the farmers and an economic uplift opportunity for them there.
Would that be in the way of cash or a tax receipt?
Could be either.
Are you guys capable of doing a tax receipt?
Yep, in 2 different currencies, and either capital gains taxes or property taxes.
Well, it's not in rubles, I hope.
U.S. dollars and Canadian dollars. Yeah. In the very back.
Yeah, so how does that work if it's a one-time, is it a one-time payment? And how does that work with the consistent value of timber, you know, say we cut it and again, or something,
Kind of a snapshot in time.
So
It depends a little bit on the age of the stand, but let's say it's like a mature forest, because that's what we're talking about today. Whenever the valuation is done, that sort of sets the market value. And that's a bit risky because market values can be a little bit up and down, right? So depends on what we're talking about. Market values right now are pretty high when you look at the overall average, but they're not as high as they were like 6-8 months ago.
But is it a one-time payment?
Yeah.
Or is it like a yearly payment?
You know, I think it would be basically a one-time payment, but there might be ways to structure finances differently with creative, accountants looking into it. But again, we haven't got any direct experience with using this tool here, so it's just kind of a spitballing idea at this point. But I think if you found some people with good, financial background on taxes and valuation and lumber prices, and you might be able to structure something over a longer time frame.
So could you also offer the potential for carbon credits, some kind of carbon credit to the landowner, or to kind of mitigate the cost of the?
I would say generally not. The again, the carbon market is it works best for people who plan to log, and who can log, and who are going to log, but then decide not to. The second that you say, I'm going to buy this for conservation purposes, then you're excluded from the carbon market, generally speaking. It could. It'd be great if it did. Yeah, because otherwise you have to have a defensible case, like business case for what you're going to log, and a plan for how you're going to do it, and all that stuff to be able to put your potential market or your potential property into the avoided deforestation carbon sort of situation.
I can't think that those would automatically cancel each other out, because even if you're not logging, there is still a value every year for carbon credit.
Oh yeah, there's carbon sequestering as we speak in real time for sure. But, yeah.
So is that another mechanism to protect forests then, is to do carbon credits? And you get the benefit of the area protected, and the landowner gets the benefit of carbon credit?
Yeah, absolutely, it could be for sure. But as I mentioned before, the process of getting certified in a carbon program is intensive. There's a lot of work that needs to get done with people coming out onto the ground, auditing it, checking the number of trees, the
So
different
they fly
species.
with LiDAR, they get a drone in, they fly it with LiDAR. The LiDAR measures where the ground is and what the volume of the trees are.
Yeah, you can do it with LiDAR these days for sure.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
there's a group out of Nanaimo that does it.
Yep, for sure. But that process is definitely there's a cost to it. And then when you add it into the carbon bank, then you need to get the fees included from the people that are doing the audits of the carbon bank. And so basically the analysis that I've seen is that the cost benefit ratio is in favor of parcels or projects that are 7,000 hectares or bigger. If it's less than that, the cost benefit is not there.
Because of
Right,
the
yeah.
expense of the LiDAR, or because of the paperwork?
Probably both, but also the cost of carbon is pretty low still right now in the voluntary carbon market. It's you'd be lucky to get $20 a ton, but once we see that come up to say maybe 50, a lot of these smaller projects will become viable, I think.
There's, I don't know the brand.
This is my last slide anyway, so you can keep coming with questions if you want to. Where did I get to? Oh yeah, that was the last one. Yeah.
So I have a question on invasive species. So there's these poisonous buttercups that are going through the valley.
Okay.
Is there any intent to try and do anything about them?
Yeah, not an area of particular expertise, but what I would say is that there's a group called the Coastal Invasive Species Committee,
Yeah.
CISC, that looks at all the incoming invasive species and puts them on a criteria basically of do absolutely everything to prevent it from coming in the first place, to let's throw everything at it to make sure we eradicate it, to we just need to control it as best we can and try to keep it out of really high value conservation areas to it's here with us forever. We just need to try to live with it and manage it in that context.
Yeah.
And so you can go onto their website and find the different species and figure out which one of those categories it falls into. And if it's in one of the sort of higher level ones around like we need to eradicate it kind of thing, then they'll have best practices and potentially even funding resources to help with that. But I'm not familiar with the particular
And that was called the
Coastal Invasive Species Committee or Council?
Committee.
Committee.
Okay.
Yeah, they're your go-to for information on that one for sure. Cool. Okay, well, thanks everybody. I appreciate the questions.
And I guess I can say on behalf of the Tsolum River that we'd love to sit down with you and take a look at these areas and specific sites you're looking at and talk about how it fits into some of our work.
Yeah.